2021 takeaways. All right, John, we have 3 takeaways here. We're going to take this in a lot of different directions. Let's start with the general disappointment of the season. Your biggest disappointment and overall how you're feeling in terms of your emotions and disappointment for this season.
Yeah, if we're looking at a 10,000 foot view of this season, North Carolina came in with very high expectations. They went to the Orange Bowl last season. There was a whole hype of Heisman Howell ringing throughout the offseason. So the disappointment is that this UNC football team never really showed that level of football play that would match that hype. They maybe scratched it slightly, like I said earlier, in that game against Wake Forest, but for the most part, this was a team that was favored by double digits in multiple games, and they ended up losing. They struggled away from home on the road, and it just led to a lot of disappointment when they did not meet those high expectations that they set outside the program externally, but also that they set for themselves.
And it started in the first game against Virginia Tech, coming out flat, really disappointing on offense in that game, and then following that with losses to Georgia Tech and Florida State. Looking at a micro level, your disappointment with this team overall, they all kind of remember about position groups or positions in the 2021 season.
Yeah, I would say on offense, I'm looking at specifically 2 position groups. I think the wide receiver room was a disappointment because of how great Sam Howell is as a quarterback. He's got a rocket arm. He can make every throw. Yet a lot of those wide receivers weren't able to get open or make enough plays to help Sam Howell out. So I think that's a disappointment. And I also think the offensive line, I don't think they played to the standard they have for themselves. They did not protect Sam Howell, keep his jersey clean enough this season at all.
Yeah, the lack, like you mentioned earlier, the lack of a deep threat and an outside receiver. Joffrey Brown didn't show up and transferred. Emory Simmons transferred. Bo Krause was injured. Antoine Green stepped up in games, but there's never that consistent threat. And you mentioned offensive line. Without a deep threat and an offensive line, it's going to be hard to show off what Sam could do. I'll go defense. The hope with this team is the offense would be great and the defense would do good enough to get UNC into the winning column more often than not. The defense didn't take that next step. We're still waiting for it to take the next step where it can be a lockdown defense. Now, I do think it did show what it can be in multiple quarters against Pitt, last 3 quarters against Pitt, and then almost the whole game against NC State outside of the first quarter and outside of the last 2 minutes. We saw what Jay Bateman's defense should look like. Now they lose Gimmel, they lose Tamon Fox, Ravo Hasek, Trey Morrison, your guy. So we'll see how they replace those guys, but they do have a lot of talent in the defensive end. They've recruited really well on the defense side of the ball, but I was disappointed that they weren't able to take that next step and be a really good defense. Okay, I think a general takeaway, we can kind of build on what we've been talking about all show, is a step back in the Mack Brown era as takeaway number 2. You would think that you have 8 wins last year, build on that with 9, 10 wins. The disappointment from the hype. I think this is definitely a step back, especially how they close the season. They're not beating teams they should. They should be beating Georgia Tech, a down Florida State team. They should be killing some teams they're not killing. So I think it was definitely a step back for this team from a broad standpoint. Your kind of thoughts, you want to build on that?
Yeah, I think that we talked already about the ahead of schedule, behind schedule. Another way to talk about it is Mack Brown talks about you lose big, then you lose close, then you win close, then you win big, as sort of a program progression. And that made sense. UNC followed that. We saw that the first 2 seasons. But this year, that sort of fell apart. UNC did not lose close. There were multiple games, like the game we watched today, where UNC just sort of folded into themselves against inferior opponents. Look at the Georgia Tech game or the Florida State game.
They're losing games they're favored in.
Yes.
And that shouldn't happen.
Yeah, they're not losing close. These are games where they're losing big. And I think because of that, you can say it's a step back for this football program when you're not progressing like the way Mack Brown has sort of spelled out this team should be.
Yeah, the results on the field are not matching the recruiting classes, and that comes down to development, motivation, in-game motivation, in-game adjustments. I mean, losing to a South Carolina team that was a 9-point underdog to North Carolina is not acceptable. They didn't come out at the beginning. They didn't make any adjustments that showed on the field. So losing games like to South Carolina, to Georgia Tech, to Florida State, even Virginia Tech. I mean, Virginia Tech and Georgia Tech. Virginia Tech made a coaching change. Georgia Tech fired a bunch of assistants. First year under Shane Beamer. Florida State still has a kind of a relatively new coach. So a lot of games you'd think they would win, they didn't. And that was a step back for the Mac Brown era, I think.
And I think this is a good place to bring back in the Ryan Switzer
Yeah.
tweet that we read
Can you read
on the
again?
top of the show. Yeah, if you want to pull it back up.
All right, after
This is from Ryan Switzer. He tweeted this out.
After our 6 and 7 year in 2014, there was really a sense of look yourself in the mirror type energy in our locker room. Players have to take ownership. Offseason has to be focused, distraction-free, and purposeful to turn this around. Can't be stressed enough. It can be done. 6 and 7 is not awful. You can build on some things. It's important to take the next step in getting to year 4 under Mac Brown.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Should we hit the third point?
Yep.
Some emergences, I think.
This is players who we thought have emerged from a positive takeaway here. Sorry.
Yeah,
John.
if you're trying to end it on a positive note, I think there are a couple of underclassmen who stood out throughout the season. We've already mentioned a couple of them, Josh Downs, Cedric Gray, but Miles Murphy, on the interior of the defensive line. He's a building block who you can really count on. He's an anchor to that defensive line who can step up in years future. He's a piece on that defensive line. I think there's still more that needs to be done around him, players who need to develop. You saw UNC added someone from the transfer portal, Noah Taylor, on the defensive line, showing that maybe they don't have all the pieces they need. But a third takeaway for this season would be emergence of some underclassmen who UNC can count on in 2022 and moving forward.
Yeah, alongside Miles Murphy, who will be a star next year and the leader of the defense, you have Javari Ritzie, who played anywhere between 25 to 50 snaps every game. So next year, I imagine he comes into a starting role alongside Miles Murphy. Maybe they get to that position where they have the 3 big down linemen with Miles Murphy, KJ Hester, and Javari Ritzie. He's an athletic freak. So I think those guys are worth mentioning. We mentioned Josh Downs. Cedric Gray is a key piece. I think we should mention Bryson Nesbitt, the tight end. He had a couple catches today. He's flashed here and there. He and Kamari Morales will emerge as the starting tight ends next year and playmakers in the offense. That's another player who's flashed at times and should have a big offseason to emerge there. I think an area that needs work is certainly the defensive backs. We're pretty high on Storm Duck and Tony Grimes, but they at times have been good, at times have been disappointments as well.